out to eat, you're not going to survive the night. A short-term physical crisis. And the stress response is what you do with your body. You secrete adrenaline and 11 other hormones I won't torture you with. The stress response reestablishes homeostatic balance. That's all you need to know about the subject if you're a zebra or a lion. If you're a human, though, you've got to expand the definition in a very critical way, which is, among us, some of the time we turn on the stress response because we've had a challenge in homeostatic balance, all of that sort of thing, but some of the time we turn on the stress response because we think we're just about to be stressed. And if it turns out that you're right, hooray for you, you know, here comes the elephant, you don't have to wait to be stomped by it before increasing your blood pressure. You can have an anticipatory stress response, which is great. On the other hand, if you think that way all the time, and you're constantly assuming that there are stressors coming that do not really exist, we have technical terms for you. You're being neurotic as hell. You're being anxious, you're being paranoid, you're being hostile, you're being profoundly human. Sit down a hippo and try to describe what the prime lending rate is, and he's going to have no idea what you're talking about. But we do, and that's the central concept in the whole field. We cognitively, socially sophisticated primates turn on the exact same stress response as does that zebra running for its life or a lion running for a meal, and we turn it on for purely psychological reasons. We turn it on with memories, with emotions, with thoughts, and the whole punchline is that's not what it evolved for. What stress is like for 99% of the beasts on this planet is 3 minutes of screaming terror in the savannah, after which it's either over with or you're over with. And what do? We turn on the identical stress response for 30-year mortgages. And that's where you begin to get the wear and tear in the system.
All right, so great point by Sapolsky is that having the ability So, what Sapolsky was saying with having an anticipatory response for stress is great because, unlike animals, we can cognitively predict, and anytime we can predict and get out ahead of a change like a stressor, then that's a good thing, right? It helps us survive better. So that's normal. The stress response normally is great, but it's supposed to be an acute response and only on demand, only when it's really needed to accompany stress. The other point that Sapolsky made is that because we have this cognitive capacity, right, unlike animals, we worry about things. We can think about stressors that are psychological stressors, not just physical stressors, where animals are really responding to situations and the environment. Physical stressors. We respond to physical stressors, but also psychological stressors. So abnormal situations with stress, there's sort of 3 of them, right? So if you need a stress response and you can't access it, right? So there is an acute physiological challenge and you're not able to turn on that stress response, that's an abnormal situation, problematic. Second, if the stress response is chronic, meaning you can't shut it off, and it's designed to turn off in about 30 minutes on its own, but if we don't turn it off if we're chronically stressed, right, that's an abnormal situation, and that can be bad. We'll see how that has negative effects. Or the third thing is if you have constant intermittent stressors, that can be a really bad thing and can be damaging. So those are the things that we want to make sure that we avoid with stress. All right. So today our goal is really just to cover an overview of the stress system in humans, and then we'll dive into some research publications. So we're going to have a discussion. You have 2 research publications for Wednesday that we'll talk about. Okay. So, and one of those is about potential differences between the way men and women respond in stressful situations. Anyway, we'll talk about that. So the stress system, when the stress system is activated, we're going to activate our sympathetic nervous system. So if you remember, the autonomic nervous system has two parts: the sympathetic, which is your fight or flight, that action system, and then the parasympathetic system, which is in opposition to the sympathetic. So they have the same target organs in our body. The sympathetic is the arousal, parasympathetic is the relaxing system, right? Or maintenance system. So stress is going to activate the sympathetic nervous system, and in absence of stress, we want to activate the parasympathetic system to get back to that homeostasis. Right? Some things about these systems. One, the sympathetic system is all connected through a ganglion chain, and that means that when it's activated, all the target organs are activated at the same time. So it's a complete holistic response. And the neurotransmitter that the sympathetic nervous system is going to use is norepinephrine, also sometimes referred to as noradrenaline. It's the same thing, just two different names for it. And then the parasympathetic system is going to use acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. Two different neurotransmitters because we have the same target. Right? Release norepinephrine on the heart, it's going to increase the heartbeat. Release acetylcholine on the heart, it's going to slow the heartbeat down. Right? The parasympathetic system has separate pathways, individual pathways, so deactivating or returning to homeostasis happens in an individual way for each of those target organs and at different times. So while the sympathetic system is like all or nothing, right? It happens all at once. The parasympathetic system is a little slower and can individually regulate those things. All right. So I mentioned norepinephrine and noradrenaline. We also have a more immediate response, epinephrine or adrenaline, and that happens at the very start of the sympathetic nervous system. Sort of the release of that chemical sort of jacks the whole system up and turns it on, and then norepinephrine is sort of the sustained activity in that system. So you get like a shot of adrenaline, and then norepinephrine sustaining the fight or flight. Acetylcholine's calming. It's also the major neurotransmitter in the motor system, the neuromuscular junction. The autonomic system is accessed by the stress system, the HV8 axis that we'll talk about, but it's separate. And it can, other things can regulate activity in the sympathetic nervous system that's not stress. So while stress can activate the sympathetic nervous system, other things can also activate the sympathetic nervous system. When you get on a treadmill and you start working out hard and your heart rate goes up, it's going up because norepinephrine is being released from the autonomic nervous system, that you're not in any stress. Right? So other things can activate that. After a big meal, we want to stimulate your digestive system to become really active. That's happening through the parasympathetic system, but it's not in response to stress. And then finally, the brain is sort of the master gland controlling all of this, right? And if you haven't read this, I want to make sure to point out to read this story that Sapolsky tells on pages 27 to 29 about Gilliman and Shalley. And these two guys started out working together trying to figure out what chemical, how does this whole system work? Like, what is the chemical, the neurotransmitter that controls the pituitary gland? And then they had a falling out and actually came to really hate and despise each other and went to separate labs and were racing each other to figure this out. And Sapolsky tells the story really well. It's one of the things I love about using this textbook is all of the sort of behind the scenes about science sort of stories that he includes in the text. So I won't spoil the ending, but read that because Sapolsky tells it really well. I'll also mention, you've probably seen in your book that there are a lot of footnotes here, and so don't just skip over those. They contain a lot of important information. A lot of times, Sapolsky wrote this for lay people to read, but he includes a lot of the science and sort of the technical stuff in these footnotes. So that's important for you to know. make sure you're paying attention to. All right, so the HPA axis. The hypothalamus, that's the brain, that's the master gland, right? The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland through the infundibulum, through that stalk that comes out. And so the pituitary gland, tiny little gland in the human brain, very tiny, very powerful though. And the pituitary gland has two parts, the anterior and the posterior pituitary. And from the anterior pituitary, in response to stress, ACTH is released. So from the hypothalamus, the signal in the stress hormone is corticotrophin releasing hormone. And that causes release of ACTH. From the pituitary, that's now a hormone outside the blood-brain barrier. The ACTH goes to the adrenal cortex and causes glucocorticoids, cortisol in particular, to be released. And that then, there are glucocorticoid receptors on almost every cell in the body. Stress, as we're going to see throughout all these chapters, all these different systems, can impact pretty much everything in our body. All right. There is the adrenal gland has two parts. It has a cortex, like the brain's cortex, like surrounding tissue, and it has an inner part called the medulla. And the medulla is what's going to release that the sympathetic nervous system. It's part of the epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then the adrenal cortex is what's going to release the cortisol, glucocorticoids. All right. So, corticotrophin releasing factor, or hormone. So sometimes you'll see this as CRH, sometimes you'll see it as CRF. So the factor and the hormone are kind of used interchangeably, but it's the same chemical. Is released from the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. So the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus actually has neurons that travel down, the axons go through that infundibulum and form synapses on a group of cells in the anterior pituitary, ACTH cells. And those PBN axons are releasing that corticotrophin releasing hormone on that group of cells that then stimulate the release of ACTH from the pituitary, from the anterior pituitary. The ACTH, as I mentioned then, travels through the blood to the adrenal cortex, causing cortisol, which is a type of glucocorticoid, to be released from the adrenal cortex. So why have this complicated cascade, this complicated thing? Why not just have the brain release cortisol? See, I'm not talking in a video now, so I'll answer questions. So why have this complicated, like, three-step process? Why not just have one thing that does it? Yes, Caitlin?
Amplification.
Amplification, exactly. Right? We have a dedicated gland, the adrenal gland, and its only job is to release large amounts, right, of cortisol or norepinephrine, large enough that can circulate in our blood supply and go act on all these other systems. For the brain to do that, it would be really difficult, right? So a very little bit, a tiny bit of CRF can be released on those cells. A bigger signal of ACTH then can be released to go through the blood to the adrenal gland, which then its only job is to have this stress response. In addition to amplification, these chemicals can do other things. So for instance, CRH also inhibits the release of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. So when we talk about stress and reproduction, when we get to that area, and we see the negative effects, how stress can inhibit reproduction, that it has that ability to do that because it can act on more than one system, right? It can act on more than one system. Okay, so when then we have the stress response. One of the primary outputs or outcomes of having a stress response is to gear up our metabolism and our fuel, our energy supply. So if you're that zebra, you can get away from the lion. Right? We need to have a lot of energy for our muscles. Right? Short burst of energy. That's the normal acute response in stress. And as sort of Sapolsky mentioned, this response typically, it's 3 minutes, and the animal either lives or the animal dies, right? And then you don't need that stress response anymore. So the system is set up in humans to turn off, to shut itself off in about 30 minutes or less. So there's a negative feedback system where cortisol, so here we have corticotropin-releasing hormone, ACTH, cortisol, coming back to inhibit at both the level of the pituitary and the PVN, acts as an inhibitor to prevent the future activation of cortisol. Right? So cortisol can shut itself down. And this whole process takes, as I mentioned, about 30 minutes. Now, if the stressor doesn't go away, the PVN and the anterior pituitary can override that negative feedback, right? So it's not so powerful of a system that it's absolutely going to shut it down. It's just in absence of the PVN being activated that it normally would inhibit and turn the system off. And unfortunately, not just physical stressors, but psychological stressors can also override the system. That's where we get problems with chronic stress. Okay, there are 2 primary glucocorticoid receptors that we're going to talk about in the brain. There's glucocorticoid receptors, which are shown in figure A. So this is a slice of a rat's brain. It's been stained for these 2 particular receptors. And mineralocorticoid receptors, and so we'll talk about these as GR, and those as MR and D. And if you look at that, what difference do you see between the distribution of the glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid receptors? First of all, can you identify any of those structures in the brain that are labeled? What do you think AMG is? Amygdala. Here's the PVN. Does the PVN have a lot of glucocorticoid receptors? Right here, it's very bright, very red. What are those receptors doing? What's the job of those receptors? As you're going to test the calling on Wednesday, so we need to have a research discussion on Wednesday. That's the negative feedback, right? Those are the receptors that are turning off the PVN. And there's a lot of them there. All right, does anyone know what this structure is that's labeled DG and CA1 and CA3? It's also shown there. Any guesses at what structure that is? The DG stands for dentate gyrus. That's the hippocampus. Okay? Kind of looks like the hippocampus, right? It's different than in humans. It's a rat brain, right? Well, what's the job of the hippocampus? Memory, learning and memory, right? So we're already seeing that there's a lot of receptors in the hippocampus to be acted on by the stress response. So you're going to see that memory and the ability to learn things is affected by stress. So what do you notice the primary difference between GR expression and MR expression? Yeah, so the MR receptors are pretty much localized to the hippocampus, maybe a little bit in the amygdala. But it's not, they're not used in that negative feedback loop. They're different, right, than GR. And so they're doing two different things. You have two different receptors. The whole point of neurotransmitters and neurotransmitter receptors is that they have selective actions, right? And we're going to see that there's a very specific role for GR receptors in the hippocampus, and it's different from the role of MR receptors. GR receptors are expressed throughout a lot of the cortex, a lot of the brain, including the amygdala, the PDN, and so it's the job of the amygdala. A lot of the stress will act with the amygdala. Fear response and emotional value. Right? So we want to assign negative emotional value to things activating the stress response. All right. So here's our dentate gyrus, our hippocampus. And as you can see, right, it has both glucocorticoid in red and mineralocorticoid in blue receptors there. If we have fewer of these receptors, right, then our circulating level of cortisol is going to be higher. Right? So if we look at sort of resting levels of cortisol, sort of baseline levels when there's no stressor present, the more receptors we have, anytime there's cortisol present, it's going to have a more negative effect and lower our, more receptors are going to lower our circulating cortisol in absence of a stressor. We're talking about when the system's activated, right? Just to rest. If you happen to have fewer receptors there, and we'll see reasons why people might have fewer receptors in that area, then your circulating levels of cortisol are going to be higher because your negative feedback loop is not as strong as somebody with a lot of receptors. All right. So targets of the HPA axis, what gets activated by cortisol? Well, obviously the sympathetic nervous system does, and there's peripheral tissue activation. Right? The hippocampus that we just talked about is activated, and in the normal stress response, that activation actually promotes learning. Right? You want to remember, if you're walking through the woods, right, and you're like, what's that smell? And then you hear something and you see a bear, that's going to be a very stressful, physical stressor situation for you, right? And you're going to run and try and get away. And at the same time that you're having the fight or flight response, your hippocampus is logging all this information and creating learning and memory. You don't have to sit there and study that stuff in order to remember. It's an automatic process. And so if you run away and you survive, you're going to have a very strong reinforced memory of that smell and the association of that smell, which is a very good survival thing, because if you ever are walking in the woods again and smell that, you'll know there's a bear nearby, and you will, hopefully you can get out of the place before the stress response is activated. It's the whole point of this predicting stressors, right? We'll also see, though, that there's a role for chronic stress, and chronic stress actually inhibits the ability to form memories. So the normal system set up to make memories, the abnormal stress situation then starts to have a negative effect on the hippocampus. So prolonged exposure, we can actually overexcite and have neurons actually dying in the hippocampus, and we get less connectivity. There's actually a role that we'll see where you actually have to have amygdala activity at the same time as the hippocampus activity. That they sort of combine and produce this negative chronic effect. But again, we'll talk about that. We'll have a whole section on working with stress. As we mentioned, the amygdala has a lot of receptors for glucocorticoids, for cortisol. And this is going to help with the fear response, help motivate us emotionally to deal with the stressor, and help assign negative value to those stimuli that are present. Right? And then, as I mentioned, there's also a feedback loop, or no, sorry, I said the hippocampus. So there's a connection, that's not mentioned here, between the amygdala and the hippocampus, and they are talking to each other. But there's also a feedback loop to the hypothalamus, to the PBN, to reinforce further activation. So while cortisol has a negative feedback, this is a positive control. So when the amygdala is present, that can help stimulate that stress response. Right? So if you become fearful or anxious, and there's not a physical stressor present yet, that can be a benefit to go ahead and activate the stress response. The locus coeruleus, we mentioned that last week. That's in the brainstem medulla area, and it's the nucleus that controls release of norepinephrine in the brain. So when norepinephrine, particularly high amounts of norepinephrine, are released from the locus coeruleus, that's going to heighten your sort of arousal and cognitive functioning and vigilance, which would be very good if you're trying to escape from there, and you need to think really quickly and make very fast decisions about what you need to do to get out of it. In fact, some first responders will report that when they're in a dangerous situation, like a firefighter going into a fire or something like that, they talk about it feels like time slows down. Well, time doesn't actually change, but what happens is their brain becomes so aroused and vigilant that it's thinking so much faster that it feels like you're accomplishing more in the same amount of time, right? So it feels like time is slowing down, but really your brain is sped up so much. Okay, so I mentioned that the pituitary has two parts. The anterior pituitary has neurons, like the PBN neurons, that come down and release neurotransmitters to stimulate groups of cells that then release a whole bunch of hormones. So I mentioned luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone that are signals to the ovaries about in the reproductive cycle. There's other things like growth hormone, prolactin, all sorts of thyroid-stimulating hormone, in addition to ACTH, right? So there's all sorts of different hormones that are released from the pituitary. The posterior pituitary is a little different. Neurons from the hypothalamus come down and form connections with blood vessels in the posterior. So there are groups of cells in the posterior pituitary, but the axon terminals themselves from the hypothalamus forming synapses on blood vessels, and they're releasing their neurotransmitters as hormones, neurohormones, directly into the bloodstream. And there's only two hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and vasopressin. So sort of the easiest way to remember how the system works is to memorize that oxytocin and vasopressin are the two released from the posterior pituitary, and then you know any other pituitary hormone has to come from the anterior pituitary, instead of trying to remember all those different ones from the anterior pituitary. Right? So if it's not oxytocin or vasopressin, it's coming from the anterior. And we'll talk about oxytocin. I think that's mentioned in our research publications for us, that has a role in creating bonds between people, and it's a very sort of complicated, complex sort of emotional role. And so we don't fully understand a lot of what is going on with oxytocin, but we understand some from some animal models, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. Vasopressin does a lot of things. Vasopressin can act on our blood vessels to cause vasoconstriction. It can act on our kidneys to cause water conservation. So it has lots of different functions. And it probably plays a role, it looks like in some animal models at least, in some of that social bonding along with oxytocin. All right. Oh, I just mentioned it. Sorry. So, yeah. And oxytocin also plays a role in some reproductive behaviors. If you guys probably aren't as familiar with this because you haven't been through childbirth, but if you need to stimulate, induce labor, right, they'll give you a chemical called pitocin, which is the oxytocin synthesized oxytocin. So oxytocin is the chemical that initiates sort of uterine contractions and labor. It also has a role in lactation. But then, as I mentioned, it has some roles in some complex behaviors like social bonding as well. And then, as I mentioned, vasopressin acts on the kidneys, acts on blood vessels, but also plays a role in some complex social interactions. And so it's been sort of implicated in things like maybe autism spectrum disorder. We see some abnormalities in vasopressin receptors. Schizophrenia and depression also play a role in that. All right, other stress responses. Stress acts on our pain system. So our natural pain management system is going to help prevent stimulation by substance P, by the pain neurotransmitter, our endorphins and enkephalins. So obviously, if you're that zebra trying to get away and you get nicked by the lion, you still want to be able to run away, so you don't want to feel that pain as much until you're out of that stressful situation. Right? So you can have things like stress-induced analgesia, where a very stressful system activates this sort of this pain prevention system. Those also act as a reward signal, and so that can get, we'll talk about how the reward system involved in stress as well. The pancreas, the stress response acts on the pancreas to release glucagon. Glucagon is a signal that we need more blood glucose. And it prevents insulin release, which is the opposite from glucagon. And that glucagon is then going to stimulate the liver to convert glycogen into glucose and increase our blood glucose, again, ramping up our metabolic needs. Decreases the release of insulin. Insulin is a signal that we have high blood glucose and we need to store it as glycogen. And cells need to use that, that blood glucose. This we'll talk about in the next couple of weeks. I think maybe next week, coming up soon, about obesity and digestion and stress. And so when we start talking about that, it's important to remember these effects on the pancreas. Prolactin is another chemical that suppresses reproductive effects, and the stress response increases that. It helps inhibit estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, the sex steroid hormones. And then finally, when we talk about growth, and particularly in childhood, when there's a lot of growth going on, you can have inhibition of growth hormone release. So again, you're probably starting to see how the stress system can act on all of these different systems, right? Not just your fight or flight, but reproduction, aging, growth, memory, emotional state, and the reward systems, addiction. We'll talk about that. So all these different systems, it has these wide, sort of far-reaching effects. All right. So this is a good sort of summary of what we've been talking about. 3 stages of stress. You have your normal, acute alarm stage. This is your fight or flight. It has 4 sort of components. We're going to increase glucose. We're going to increase circulation. We're going to accelerate heart rate and respiration, which is going to give more oxygen to our brain and get more glucose circulating in the body. And in general, all the cell's activity, they're going to say that there's glucocorticoid receptors on almost every cell in your body. What it's doing on this peripheral tissue is it's causing that tissue to become more active, right, to increase its energy needs. Then, if we get into chronic activation, we start to have negative effects, right? And so we get into having things like growth hormone being inhibited. We get changes in our salt sort of electrolyte balance, right? And so having these constant elevated energy stores means that we're getting lipids released by our adipose tissue to start trying to meet that demand. And that could be negative if we have elevated cholesterol and lipids circulating in our body for long periods of time, negative effects. The elevated blood glucose for a long time puts a strain on our liver, right? Having very high blood glucose levels. And we get this sort of abnormal response. And so this normal alarm stage, like I said, is set to be about 30 minutes. It should turn off in about 30 minutes. When we start exceeding that, for prolonged periods of time, we can get damage to these vital organs and vital systems. Right? And so that can then lead to a collapse of those in the exhaustion stage. That's where we really start to see the negative effects of the resistance stage. All right. So a couple of points, last points today. The autonomic nervous system is different from the stress response of the HPA axis. It can be different, right? It's doing a lot of things. It's not just the stress response. Sympathetic nervous system can be activated through vigilance, increased arousal, worry, fear, anxiety, lots of things like that. The issues with the HPA axis, where we have where chronic activation actually changes how the HPA axis responds, can lead to things like depression and the condition of learned helplessness. And you can think about that. If you're chronically having stress, you start to become desensitized to this high level of cortisol all the time. And that's where that sort of helplessness, you learn that this is not an adaptive response. And there are differences in the magnitudes of different stress responses. We can have small and large stress responses, the patterns of stress response, and then we talked about receptor sensitivity, right? How much of those glucocorticoid receptors you have, right, is going to change the sensitivity of the system. And then coming up on our papers that we're going to look at for Wednesday, we'll start talking about some sex differences in the stress response. And so there are two readings, and we're going to talk about tend and befriend versus fight or flight. And these are sort of generalizations, but so overgeneralizations, because women have fight or flight responses, and men can do the tend and befriend as a coping mechanism to stress as well. But in general, it seems like male animals, if we look at it in the animal world, right, have this different response to stress in terms of a fight or flight, whereas female animals tend to form bonds to cope with stress or prevent stress. And that's what our papers are on. All right, questions? Get out of here a little bit early, 5 minutes. All right, so make sure that you have some notes, that you have something to say on Wednesday. Come prepared for that, because I am going to make everybody talk. So, all right.